There's really only one reason that women cheat on their husbands, and everything else that you might have heard or read or watched about why women cheat, they're all going to boil down to this one reason. That's what we're going to talk about today, and I hope that you'll stick with me to the end of this video, because at the end, I'm going to share a little bit of a story from a client of mine who's actually lived through this in the worst possible way. Not only was his wife having an affair, he heard it, he saw pictures, like he was way, way too close to it. And yet he has found hope. He has found his way through this, and he's been able to process all of the difficult emotions so that he can start to heal and move forward. So if you're living with this right now, first I'm going to help you understand why she did it. But then at the end of the video, I'm also going to give you some hope and some tools for getting through this if this is the reality that you're living in right now. So in just a moment, I'm going to share the one reason that women cheat on their husbands. This video is a request from a client who actually wrote me an email saying, hey, could you speak to this in one of your videos? And I'm going to share his request with you with his permission, because I think his story is really going to resonate for you if your wife, ex-wife, or soon-to-be ex-wife has had an affair. You're going to understand just how this guy is feeling. So here's what he said. I wanted to ask if you could do the same on why wives go outside the marriage bed and engage in emotional and physical affairs. In my case, our marriage seemed fine by all accounts, but yet she started an emotional affair with another man that lasted for about 8 months, and then it turned into a sexual affair in the last 4 months until I found out about it. During this time frame, she was still able to perform her wifely and motherly duties without missing a beat. I had no idea, absolutely no idea, not even a slight suspicion until the last part of the affair. She was able to function at a high level with the family dynamics, with all of our day in and day out routines and schedules. Everything seemed normal. We spent an enormous amount of time together when not at work. All our normal conversations about us, family, and work felt completely organic and natural. We laughed and joked and cuddled and watched tons of Netflix together. Our sex life seemed normal and great. Yet she had this other thing secretly going on in the background. Through the holiday season, she was all about the family. I could go on and on about how I'm just blown away that a person could have 2 different lives at the same time. Now, this might be your story, right? Maybe your wife did something similar, just leading this total double life. Or maybe you did notice that there were other signs and symptoms that things weren't okay at home while this affair developed. But what I hear from a lot of men is that it's quite shocking, and they don't understand how she could go about leading these 2 lives. Which one is true? Which one is her? What's the lie? And it can start to feel like you don't know this person at all. And that betrayal is very, very deep, right? It's not just the sexual betrayal or even the emotional betrayal. It's the sense that your partner, this person that you've committed to share a life with, might actually be somebody that you don't know at all. So why do they do it? Why do women cheat on their husbands? And how can they do it with such a clean split, living a normal life and yet having this wild affair at the same time? So affairs always, always, always boil down to one thing: trauma. And I want to define this because trauma is not necessarily sexual abuse as a child or neglect or abandonment experiences. Trauma is what happens inside of us in response to some external circumstance that damages our ability to connect in relationships with other people. Right? So a lot of different things can hurt our ability to sustain healthy relationships. And any of the reasons you hear about affairs boil down to trauma, to a damaged ability to connect and relate. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and then I'm going to speak specifically to what was going on in this particular client situation. So a lot of the reasons that you'll hear for women having affairs are things like low self-esteem, craving excitement, anger or retribution for a partner's perceived lacks or errors. You might hear things like, oh, it's because of insecure attachment or midlife crisis. It's a way to numb emotional pain. It's due to mental health conditions, or it's due to emotional isolation in the marriage. Every single one of these reasons is actually about trauma. Right? Low self-esteem. Babies are not born with low self-esteem. Babies are born confident, curious, playful, adventurous. Low self-esteem is something we learn. Something happens to us. It teaches us that we're not good enough, that we're not valued, that we're not lovable. And we learn how to cope with that in certain ways. And that might be that we seek out a lot of external validation or attention. And that can certainly lead to cheating for some women and for some men. And it's that desire, that need, maybe even a compulsive need for external validation and assurance that we are good enough, because at some point as a child, we learned that we weren't. And the thing to keep in mind with trauma is that when our ability to feel safe in relationships gets damaged quite young, the way that we survive that tends to form a pretty rigid pattern. So if something happens to us when we're young and we learn that we act out and seek attention, and that makes us feel better, that helps us get through, that behavior pattern can become quite rigid, quite ingrained, and very subconscious. And so I happen to know in this particular case, the man who asked me to speak to this, his wife had quite a strong history of childhood trauma on a couple of different levels. And one of the ways that she coped as a young woman was to reach out and seek support. And she actually coped through acting out sexually a lot of her youth. And this is something that happens to a lot of people, men and women, that sex fills the gap where emotional connection and support is lacking. And so if that's not coming from your parents, if that wasn't available to you, and again, this is not just women, this is for men too, often they'll use sex as a way to seek intimacy and connection when the emotional piece is lacking. And sometimes sex actually becomes a safe way to seek connection because it is incredibly intimate, but you can have sex without having emotional closeness. And so for people that have learned that it's not safe to be emotionally close, or that deep emotional relationships are going to let them down, right? If your parents were not emotionally engaged, if your mother was cold, if your father was angry or loud, or vice versa, or your parents were disappointed and had that horrible glare, or you were simply left alone a lot of the time to self-soothe and get through scary feelings by yourself, you might have learned, she might have learned, that emotional connection and safety wasn't really safe or wasn't stable. And so for people who have had that kind of experience, sex can become like this halfway point. It gives you a feeling of that intimacy, a feeling of that connection, but because there's not a deeper emotional tie there, the bottom can't drop out on you. You can't be hurt in the same way. So sex is like a way to get the oxytocin, literally the drug of bonding, to release in your brain without becoming emotionally attached or more emotionally connected. So there's a lot of different ways that trauma can affect our sexual behaviors. In this particular case, one of the things that stands out is that this woman's ability to segregate the two parts of her life, right? She's having this sexual affair and then she's home with her husband and her kids, and how is that possible? This is another impact of trauma. One of the things that this is not true for every person's trauma, it depends on how we survived what happened to us. But for a lot of people, the way they survive is they split off parts of themselves. They learn to shut down their sensitive, kind, loving part to survive abuse, to survive neglect, to survive rejection. They learn to not allow certain parts of themselves to be seen, to avoid being bullied, to avoid being abandoned, to avoid being hurt, or to avoid burdening a parent who doesn't seem like they can handle it, a parent who's really struggling. Right? So we might learn to shut off a part of ourselves that expresses its needs or asks for what we want or need to be okay. We might shut that down in order to make sure everyone else is okay so that we're okay. Right? We might learn to hide our anger, or to hide our sexual desire, or to hide even the part of us that is soft and loving if that's not safe. Right? And so a lot of times when somebody's been through a traumatic experience, they survive it by closing off parts of themselves. And now that can come out in adulthood in a couple of different ways. Some people get stuck and a part of them is always closed off and they really can't access the softer parts of themselves. This is true for a lot of people who have a hard time feeling emotions or connecting emotionally. But in this case, right, this man, his wife wasn't having that experience. She wasn't shut off emotionally. She was loving. She was there. She was connected with him. But she had this totally different relationship going on, this almost totally different persona in the affair, right? And that just tells us that part of the way she survived her trauma, her childhood experiences, was that she split off the loving, nurturing, part of herself from this daredevil, risk taker, adrenaline hungry part of herself that helped her get through her adolescence, right? And so all that was happening for him at home was that he was engaging with one part of her, and she had successfully compartmentalized the other one so that it wasn't interfering in her family life. But that other part of her was still really strong and active. And so when she's in this affair, that other part lights up. And I know this can sound a little strange. It's not like she has multiple personalities or doesn't know who she is or what she's doing. We all develop survival masks as we grow up, faces that we put on, roles that we play in order to get through our family life, to get through our school environment, to make it in a world that has a lot of high expectations for us and a very low tolerance for our very human emotions. We all learn to hide our grief, to hide our fear, to hide our anger in different ways. And when somebody's had more severe trauma in their life, those masks can become a lot stronger and a lot more rigid, and they can really compartmentalize certain parts of their personality apart from each other so that they can't damage each other. The problem is when we have that unhealed disconnect, we're prone to do things like have an affair that can damage and even ruin our marriage or our relationships. So trauma is ultimately the root of infidelity. I recently learned that term emotional starvation, and it's a very apt description for what happens to some people in relationships, right? If your partner is emotionally unavailable or even physically unavailable and you're really alone in the relationship, there isn't that emotional intimacy or connection. You've tried to cultivate it and it's not working. You're not getting through to them that this is what you need. You might feel emotionally starved in your marriage. And there's a lot of articles and videos out there that say that this is why women cheat, because the man is emotionally oblivious or he's suppressed his emotions and he's not capable of creating that deeper emotional intimacy that she needs. And so she goes outside of the marriage and forms these emotional connections that then lead to physical connections. But even this is also rooted in trauma, because a healthy person in a relationship where there is no emotional intimacy will do one of two things. They will either take steps to fix it. They will find the root causes for it, address it with their partner and get support in healing that connection, or they will leave the relationship, right? Somebody who stays in that emotionally starved relationship and seeks the emotional connection elsewhere, the physical connection, physical intimacy elsewhere, that person doesn't have a healthy skill set in handling conflict or problems in their relationships. And that means that they grew up without that healthy role model for how to handle conflict, how to navigate and resolve problems in relationships, right? They're carrying their survival skills, right? Where maybe they didn't feel like they had the power to resolve issues in their relationships when they were a child. And there were problems, and so they just got through it, right? And they sought the emotional connection wherever it was available. And so now as an adult in this relationship, they're not even fully aware of their adult power to change and choose how their relationships unfold. So they're still acting in that childish manner of saying, oh my gosh, this relationship isn't okay. This isn't working. It's not giving me what I need. So I better just get it here because I can, right? It's true for a child, right? A child doesn't have a choice. You're being raised by these parents. You don't get to just pick up and leave. So if they're not able to give you the emotional connection you need, if you were emotionally starved as a child in your home, you did have to get it wherever you could, right? But as an adult, that's not true anymore. Now you can leave this relationship. Now you can sit down and communicate with this partner. Now you can go to couples counseling. You have other options as an adult, but people still act in that same childish pattern because they're carrying that survival skill from childhood and they've never examined it, they've never healed the underlying wound, and then they've never grown up emotionally so that they can handle their relationship issues and conflicts in a healthier adult fashion. And really, that's what trauma does. Trauma freezes us in time. It causes our brains to forget that we are adults, that we have choices, that we have resources available to us, that we can ask for help, that we can change our circumstances in ways that we could not when we were children. And it's one of the hallmarks of trauma that the brain loses the ability to distinguish then from now. And so when we're triggered, we react as though it was then, as though I was still a 5-year-old kid who didn't have options, as though I was still a 12-year-old girl who didn't have these choices. Right? And if you look at any instance of a woman cheating on her husband, or a man cheating on his wife for that matter, you can trace it back to these very childish patterns of behavior, these childish survival skills that have become rigid and that have never been upgraded. Right? The brain hasn't upgraded to realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm not a little kid anymore. I can handle these things differently. And that ultimately is the role of therapy. It's the role of coaching, any kind of personal development, self-help work. It's all about helping us recognize these old patterns, these things we're carrying forward from childhood experiences that don't serve us, that don't help us have healthy relationships or a successful adult life, so we can start to let them go and heal. And so if you are dealing with a wife, an ex-wife, or a soon-to-be ex-wife who is cheating, then you are also going to have some childhood patterns that need to be upgraded. We all do. And they're going to come out for you in these really overwhelming emotions. And you'll have to start noticing, how are you reacting to the news of her cheating? Are you getting angry? Are you lashing out? Are you withdrawing and hiding? Are you desperately trying to get her back and seeking her approval? Maybe you do all of those things in a different order. Regardless of why she cheated, what her specific trauma story, childhood patterns, ability to split off different parts of her personality are, regardless of all of that, what's important right here and right now is your healing. And I want to share the same man who asked me this question, who asked me to speak to the psychology behind what women are thinking when they make these choices. He did the hard work of learning to sit with these strong, overwhelming emotions and process them in a healthy way. And he shared in my Better Beyond Divorce community just a really beautiful post where he talked about his feelings and the things he was feeling around the affair, and also his grief. And what was beautiful about it was that he was able to peel back all these layers: the shock, the denial, the anger, the confusion, and get to the grief underneath it, because that's what an affair leaves us with. Right? There's all of these other feelings, but at the base of it is a sadness, because this was a person that you thought was there for you, and they've betrayed that trust. And there's a rejection, there's a hurt, there's a grief and a loss there. And so when he posted this really beautiful post about how he was feeling, I asked him, how did it feel to write that post? And I'm going to share that comment with you because I think it will give you some insight into what this healing process for you can really look like. He says, initially there was an overwhelming sense of sadness and grief, but I noticed it was different than normal. It was like my brain was trying to tell me something, but I ignored it and suppressed any thoughts associated with it. But when I finally stopped resisting and turned inward and faced these thoughts and emotions, it finally revealed itself. I miss her. I mean, I knew I missed her, but I was caught up in the narrative. She did this and she did that. She said this and she said that. It's her fault that I'm in pain. But when I didn't allow that narrative to speak, but I just became curious and observed everything that was going on inside me, a cleansing and healing started to occur. It was like a dam broke, and all the emotional buildup I had inside of me finally started to flow out unrestrained and without any resistance or suppression from me. The tears and the snot started flowing, and I started typing. I feel like I turned the corner somewhere inside me emotionally. It was like my brain and nervous system put their arm around me and thanked me for finally being honest and truthful with them and not lying to them and being in denial. I realized my marriage is in my rearview mirror, but I needed to take an emotional pit stop and be truthful with myself before I could continue along this journey. In the end, when it was all said and done, this experience was a positive one for me as I sense a necessary cleansing and healing took place. I feel like I took a couple of steps forward. I do miss her, but that's okay. If you are in the early stages of this moment, you might not even be missing her. You might just be so angry and hurt. But I can tell you this man's experience mirrors what I see men going through as they heal again and again. As we can get past the denial, past the shock, past the anger, there's grief. And once you can allow yourself to face that grief and move through it, that's when healing starts to occur and you can find an acceptance and a moving forward. If you would like support around doing that, please join me in my free masterclass, How to Take Back Control of Your Life After Divorce. In the masterclass, I share the one emotional regulation strategy that I use with all of my clients. It's the same strategy that allowed this man to finally peel back all of those layers and confront the underlying grief so that he could begin to let this go and move forward with his life. So thank you so much to my client for asking this question. Thank you to you for watching. I really hope that this video was helpful and gave you some insight into what's going on inside the skull of the woman who has done this to you. I hope you'll continue to seek support and help, and please do come into that free masterclass with me. It's going to give you a lot of tools to manage the emotional reaction, the emotional fallout that is going to happen if you've had the experience of being cheated on. All right. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the masterclass.